Bones don't always stay buried. Sometimes they rise through the dirt slowly, carried upward by rain, frost, and time, until a child's skull stares back at the sky with its jaw still locked in a scream no one answered. In the hills where this story begins, the earth is thin and restless. Graves collapse, coffins rot. And what was hidden comes back malformed, twisted, and impossible to mistake for anything but human. Locals learned long ago not to dig too deep, because the ground remembers things the living worked very hard to forget. The screams came first, not loud, not constant, but stretched thin across the nights, like wire pulled too tight. A sound that didn't belong to any animal known in those woods. Too wet to be a fox, too broken to be a child. Neighbors would wake with frost on their windows and feel it vibrating in their ribs, then roll over and pray it would stop before morning. It always did. And by daylight, no one spoke of it. If you're listening to this now, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The answer matters less than the silence around you when you think it. Because the place this story comes from had neither clocks nor cities, only seasons, blood, and memory. The valley sat folded deep into the Appalachian spine, absent from most maps and mislabeled on the rest. Early surveyors marked it as unsettled land, a mistake that went uncorrected for nearly a century. Old county records mention it only in passing, usually followed by phrases like inaccessible terrain or families declined contact. To reach it, you had to follow a creek that vanished underground twice, then climb a ridge where the trees grew bent and stunted, as if the soil itself was sick. The first cabin went up in the late 1800s, dragged together from pine logs and held upright by stubbornness alone. More followed, scattered just far enough apart that voices didn't carry easily between them. No road connected them, no church bell rang, births and deaths were recorded in the margins of a Bible so worn the pages had turned soft as cloth. Names repeated, dates blurred, the same handwriting crossed generations. Electricity never arrived, neither did doctors. Children learned early that strangers were dangerous and questions were worse. They were taught who they belonged to before they learned their own age. Family wasn't a tree here, it was a knot, pulled tighter every year. By the time the first child of this story was born, the valley had already begun to rot inward. Midwives whispered about limbs that bent the wrong way, about faces that looked unfinished, about eyes that didn't quite line up with the world. But whispers stay whispers when everyone shares the same blood, and that child, wrapped in rough cloth and held under lamplight that flickered like a dying thing, did not cry the way others did. The sound that left its mouth was thin, strained, almost ancient, as if it had been trying to scream for generations. The child was named the same way all the others were named, by reaching backward instead of forward. A grandfather's name, a great-aunt's name, something already worn thin by use. No one marked the hour of birth. Time here was counted by frost lines on the windows and how high the creek ran in spring. What mattered was that the child lived. That alone was considered mercy. From the beginning, there were signs. The bones beneath the skin felt wrong when held, too soft in some places, too rigid in others. The head tilted slightly, never quite upright, as if listening for something no one else could hear. One eye followed movement. The other lagged behind, unfocused, drifting. When the child was laid down, it did not flail or cry for warmth. It lay still, breathing shallow, studying the dark. The mother did not speak much after the birth. She had been quiet before, but now words seemed to cost her something. When neighbors came with jars of preserved food and murmured blessings, she nodded without meeting their eyes. The father stood behind her, close enough that their shoulders touched, his hand resting where her spine met her hip, a gesture that lingered too long to be dismissed as comfort. In this valley, no one commented on such things. Looking too closely had consequences. As the child grew, the differences became harder to ignore. It did not crawl when expected. When it finally walked, its gait was uneven, each step measured, careful as if gravity itself could not be trusted. Speech came late and in fragments. Words were swallowed, reshaped into sounds that belonged only to that mouth. Other children watched with a mix of curiosity and unease. They sensed, without knowing how, that this one did not move through the world the same way they did. At night, the child woke often, not crying, listening, sometimes standing silently at the foot of the bed, staring toward the door, toward the dark beyond the cabin walls. The mother would wake to find those eyes fixed on her, unblinking, reflecting the faint glow of the fire like glass pulled from old bottles. When asked what was wrong, the child would tilt its head and make a low sound in its throat, something between a hum and a growl. Animals began to avoid the yard. Chickens stopped laying. A dog that had slept under the porch for years refused to come inside, whining and backing away whenever the child stepped near. Once, a goat was found dead at the edge of the clearing, its neck twisted at an impossible angle, eyes clouded. No tracks. Led away. No one asked how it happened. The elders took notice, though they never said the child's name aloud in council. They spoke instead of omens, of tests, of bloodlines chosen to carry burdens others could not. The mother was instructed to keep the child close. The father was told to watch carefully. Some things, they said, ripened best in darkness. And as seasons passed, it became clear the child was learning things no one had taught it. Symbols scratched into dirt, shapes carved into wood, drawings made with ash on cabin walls, repeating patterns that resembled neither scripture nor nature, but something older, something folded in on itself. The valley had seen strange children before, but this one felt different, as if it had not simply been born into the decay, but had crawled out of it. By the time the child reached 7 winters, the valley had begun to bend around it. People altered their paths without realizing why, choosing longer walks through brush rather than passing too close to the cabin. Conversations stopped when the child appeared, not abruptly, but with a soft unraveling, as if words themselves had decided they were no longer safe. Even the elders, men who believed fear was a tool to be wielded, felt something tighten in their chests when those mismatched eyes lifted toward them. The drawings grew more frequent. At first, they were simple loops and lines, etched into the packed dirt near the hearth. Then came figures, stick-limbed shapes with too many joints, faces with mouths stretched wide, filled with vertical lines like teeth or bars. Sometimes the figures were connected by thick cords drawn from chest to chest, from womb to womb, forming closed circles with no beginning and no end. When the mother tried to scrub them away, the child watched in silence, then redrew them the next day, more detailed than before. At night, the screams returned. Not every night, just often enough to keep sleep shallow and uneasy. They came from the direction of the creek, echoing through the trees, rising and falling like breath pulled through damaged lungs. Once, a neighbor followed the sound with a lantern, only to find the child standing barefoot at the edge of the water, staring into the black current as if it were speaking back. The child did not turn when called. The lantern shook so badly the flame went out. There were rituals, though no one called them that. The elders gathered certain families on certain nights, timing the meetings to moonless skies. Children were sent away, doors were closed, voices dropped, the smell of smoke and iron drifted through the valley, clinging to clothes and hair long after dawn. The child was always present afterward, eyes bright, fingers stained dark, a calm settling over it that made the mother's hands tremble when she touched its face. Age seemed to sit strangely on the child. Some days it moved with the clumsiness of a much younger thing, tripping over roots, struggling with simple tasks. Other days its gaze carried a weight that made grown men look away first. It listened more than it spoke, and when it did speak, it sometimes used words no one remembered teaching it. Old words. Names pulled from family lines so distant they existed only as half-forgotten stories. Dead animals began appearing closer to the cabins. A raccoon laid out carefully on a stump, its belly opened with surprising precision. Birds arranged in circles, wings spread, heads all facing inward. The elders warned everyone to keep livestock locked up at night. They did not mention the child, but everyone thought of it. The mother began to age quickly. Her hair thinned, her back curved. She slept little and ate less. Neighbors whispered that she was being drained, though of what they could not say. The F. Atha watched all of this with a tight, unreadable expression, as if waiting for something inevitable. And beneath it all, Beneath the symbols and the screams and the rituals, a truth was pressing upward, the way bones press through soil. The child was not just strange, it was a mirror, reflecting something the valley had tried to fold in on itself for generations. The reveal was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. The truth did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through cracks, through things people said without realizing they had said them, through glances held too long, and silences that spoke louder than confession. In the valley, family histories were recited like prayers, but only the parts deemed safe. When the child began asking questions, the answers came slower, thinner, stripped of detail until they were little more than echoes. One evening, as frost crept across the inside of the windows, the child sat at the table and traced a finger through spilled ash. It drew a shape the elders recognized instantly, a looped diagram passed down in secret, meant to explain lineage without writing it down. The child looked up and asked, in a voice too steady for its age, why the same names kept touching each other. The room went still, the mother's face drained of color. The father stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet cabin. No one answered the question. Instead, the child was sent to bed, though it did not sleep. From the other side of the thin wall, the parents whispered late into the night, their voices cracking under the weight of words they had spent their lives avoiding. It was the midwife who finally spoke. She had delivered half the children in the valley, and buried nearly as many. Her hands shook as she told the mother what she already knew, but had never allowed herself to name. The child's bloodline. E did not branch. It folded. The father was more than the father. The mother was not only the mother. Roles overlapped until language itself failed to keep them separate. In this family, in this valley, marriage had never followed the rules written beyond the ridges. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, brothers married sisters when no other options remained. Each generation tightened the circle further, convinced that purity lived in sameness. The child was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that had been feeding on itself for decades. When the elders were confronted, they did not deny it. They spoke instead of necessity, of survival, of God's will. Outsiders, they said, would poison the blood. Better to endure deformity than corruption. Better to sacrifice a few than to lose everything. Their words were calm, practiced, as if they had rehearsed this defense for years. The child listened from the doorway, unseen. Something in its expression shifted, not shock or fear, but recognition, as if a missing piece had finally slid into place. The drawings changed after that. The loops became tighter, the figures more crowded, faces overlapped, sharing eyes, sharing mouths, sharing bones. News traveled quickly, though no one spoke it aloud. The valley reacted the only way it knew how, with violence disguised as purification. Animals belonging to the family were slaughtered and burned. The cabin was marked with symbols meant to ward off evil, though no one could agree on what the evil was anymore. The church elders arrived at night, carrying torches and scripture, chanting words that blurred into noise. When the cabin caught fire, it was not an accident. Flames climbed the walls hungrily, smoke rolling into the trees. The mother screamed then, truly screamed, a sound of grief and terror and relief twisted together. The father dragged her away as neighbors watched, faces lit orange, eyes reflecting the same fear they had refused to acknowledge for generations. The child did not run. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the flames consume the place it had been born. In the firelight, its shadow stretched long and distorted, folding back on itself, just like the family tree that had made it. What survived that night was not the house, nor the illusion of purity. What survived was the knowledge that something deeply wrong had been allowed to grow, unchecked, until it could no longer be hidden. And decades later, someone would come looking for the truth buried in the ashes. After the fire, the valley did what it had always done when faced with its own reflection. It closed ranks. Ashes were scattered, charred beams were dragged into the woods and left to rot beneath leaves and snow. By morning, the clearing looked almost untouched, as if the flames had been a bad dream shared by too many witnesses. The elders gathered at dawn and spoke of cleansing. They said the rot had been cut out. They said the danger had passed. No one mentioned the child. The mother was taken in by distant relatives, though distance meant little here. She sat for days without speaking, her hands curled inward, fingers rubbing together as if still feeling heat. The father disappeared entirely. Some said he went deeper into the mountains. Others said he never made it past the creek. No one searched. In the valley, unanswered questions were treated as mercies. Church meetings grew more frequent. Sermons turned darker, heavy with warnings about temptation and blood and punishment passed down through generations. Records were quietly altered, pages torn from the old Bible, names smudged with ink until they were unreadable, birth dates adjusted, deaths attributed to sickness or accident. The elders understood something essential. If the truth survived on paper, it could survive people. Children were warned not to wander near the burned clearing. They were told the ground there was cursed, that spirits lingered. And yet, some nights, neighbors swore they saw a small figure standing among the blackened stones, pale against the dark, watching the cabins from a distance too far to reach and too close to ignore. Animals continued to die, though less frequently. The screams stopped. That absence unsettled people more than the noise ever had. Silence can feel like being watched. The valley carried on. It always did. Marriages were arranged with renewed care, elders whispering longer over pairings, trying to calculate which unions might produce fewer visible mistakes. The language shifted. Children with deformities were hidden away sooner. Those who could not contribute were kept out of sight. Survival, the elders reminded everyone, required discipline. Years passed. New faces were born bearing old marks. The fire became a story told to frighten children into obedience. The child became a rumor, then a myth. Something that happened once and would never happen again, if the rules were followed properly this time. But myths have a way of leaking. In the early 1980s, long after many of the elders had died, a box surfaced in a county archive miles away from the valley. It contained photographs never meant to be seen, grainy images of faces with familiar distortions, hand-drawn family charts looping back on themselves, marginal notes written in a careful, frightened hand. A young researcher opened that box and felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched by history. The valley had tried to erase itself. It had failed, because what was burned that night did not stay gone. It settled into records, into bones, into the questions no one could quite answer. And now, after decades of silence, someone was finally asking them. The researcher was not looking for monsters. He was looking for gaps, census lines that ended abruptly, birth records without corresponding deaths, entire families that seemed to exist only in one decade and vanish in the next. He had learned that history rarely announced its crimes. It hid them in omissions. The box had been mislabeled, tucked behind agricultural reports and flood surveys. Inside were photographs curled at the edges, their surfaces cracked like dried skin. Faces stared back from another century, eyes misaligned, mouths pulled into shapes that suggested effort rather than expression. Some images were marked with dates, others only with initials. One, taken shortly after the fire, showed a clearing of blackened stones and a small figure standing just beyond the frame center, blurred as if the camera itself had recoiled. The family charts were worse. They were not trees, they were spirals. Names repeated in tight succession, lines crossing and reconnecting until the page looked more like a diagram of disease than lineage. Notes in the margins referenced necessary unions and acceptable outcomes. In one corner, written smaller than the rest, was a sentence that made the researcher stop breathing for a moment. Child exhibits consolidation traits. Monitor closely. He drove out to the edge of the valley in the fall of 1982. The road ended miles before the old settlement, but that was enough. Locals still lived nearby, though none claimed ancestry tied directly to the place. When asked, they grew vague, said it was private land, said people there kept to themselves. One older man spat into the dirt and said some families should have stayed buried. The researcher found the burned clearing by accident, or so he told himself. Blackened stones still marked the ground, arranged in a rectangle that had once been a home. The soil beneath was darker, richer, fed by ash and bone. When he knelt and brushed away leaves, he uncovered fragments that were unmistakable. Charred wood, melted glass, a small warped object that might once have been a spoon. He took samples, photographs, measurements. At night, in his motel room, he laid the materials out and compared them to the images from the archive. Patterns emerged, not just genetic ones but behavioral, the isolation, the controlled marriages, the deliberate concealment of those deemed unfit. This was not ignorance, it was management. The deeper he went, the more resistance he encountered. Requests for church records were denied. Old midwives refused interviews. One envelope he mailed never arrived. Another came back opened, its contents disturbed. A note inside read only, "Some things don't want to be found." But the truth was already loose. The researcher could feel it moving, threading together decades of silence. The child from the photographs was not an anomaly. It was a culmination, a living ledger of everything the valley had tried to deny. And somewhere beneath the dirt, beneath the stones and the carefully forgotten names, there were still bones waiting to be recognized. The first grave was shallow enough that frost had pushed part of it back to the surface. The researcher noticed it because the ground sank under his boot with a softness that didn't belong to untouched soil. When he knelt and brushed away leaves, his fingers struck something smooth, curved, unmistakably shaped. Bone does not lie about what it is. He alerted authorities quietly at first. There was no rush, no press, just a small team, careful and methodical, working under grey autumn skies. They expected a single burial, maybe two. What they found instead was a pattern. The hill rose gently behind what had once been the center of the settlement. Locals had called it children's ground, a phrase that sounded almost tender until the digging began. One grave opened into another, tiny rib cages, skulls that had never fully fused, limbs bent at angles that spoke of lives cut short before the body had a chance to settle into itself. Some bones bore signs of extreme deformity. Others showed no trauma at all, just stillness, as if breathing had simply stopped. As the days passed, the count grew. Dozens became hundreds. The oldest remains showed mild irregularities, extra digits, shallow clefts. The newer ones were harder to look at. Spines curved into sharp arcs, skulls elongated or compressed beyond anything the team had seen outside textbooks. It was a timeline written in calcium and soil. Each layer deeper into the earth marked another generation pulled tighter into the same closed circle. Word spread despite efforts to contain it. Church leaders arrived first, faces pale, voices controlled. They prayed loudly at the edge of the site, insisting the dead be reburied without examination. Some locals shouted, others wept. A few stood perfectly still, staring at the ground as if seeing something they had always known was there. Records began disappearing almost immediately. Parish books went missing. Old family Bibles were burned or buried. One night, a storage shed near the dig site caught fire. The flames were put out quickly, but the message was clear. There were still those who believed destruction was the same as erasure. The researcher worked faster. He documented everything: measurements, photographs, DNA samples. Each discovery tightened the case around a truth that could no longer be explained away as folklore or misunderstanding. This was not a single family's secret. It was a system, protected by silence and sanctified by belief. Standing at the edge of the excavation, the researcher felt the weight of it settle into his chest. The child from the photographs was no longer just a face in an archive. It was present in every grave, every twisted bone, every life that had never been given a chance to become anything else. The valley had fed on itself until there was nothing left to hide. And now the world was watching. The valley did not empty all at once. It unraveled. Families were moved quietly, one cluster at a time, relocated to places where their names meant nothing and their histories could not follow them so easily. Some resisted, clinging to cabins that had held their blood for generations. Others left without looking back, eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid it might open beneath them. Medical examinations confirmed what the bones had already said. Conditions rarely seen in isolation appeared stacked within the same bodies. Traits that should have vanished instead intensified. The human form, folded inward too many times, had begun to fail at remembering how to be whole. Doctors spoke in careful language. Researchers spoke in charts and probabilities, but among themselves they used simpler words: collapse, endpoint. The elders who were still alive offered no apologies. One of them, when shown photographs of the graves, traced a finger along a skull fractured by deformity and said only that weakness was the price of purity. His voice did not shake. It never had. To him, the suffering had been acceptable, necessary, proof that the world beyond the ridges was wrong. The researcher published his findings in fragments at first. Academic journals, conference rooms filled with people who read the data but avoided the images. Eventually, the story reached a wider audience. Headlines spoke of isolation and tragedy, of a family tree that had eaten itself alive. The photographs surfaced, the diagrams, the clearing of blackened stones. But one image never made it into print. The blurred photograph taken after the fire, the small figure standing just outside the frame. The researcher kept that one to himself. He could not explain why, only that every time he looked at it, he felt the same sensation he had felt the first day he opened the box in the archive. That history was not done speaking. The land was declared protected years later. Trails cut carefully through places where cabins once stood. A small marker placed near the burial ground, its wording cautious, respectful, incomplete. Visitors walk there now, hearing birdsong, feeling wind move through trees that have grown back crooked but alive. They stand where the house burned and feel nothing at first. Then something settles, because the valley is quiet now, but it is not empty. It holds the echo of choices made again and again in the name of blood and belonging. It holds the memory of a child who was never meant to carry so much history in one body, a child who was not born wrong but born too deep inside a circle that refused to open. So ask yourself softly without answering out loud,